As many of you know, is Nathan Spencer. I'm executive director with WakeUP Wake County, and this is our July 2021 Transportation, Land Use, and Housing Committee meeting. It is July, so I'm not, we do expect some lower numbers just because everyone is everywhere. But I really appreciate all of you for making the time to come out and join us. Having a small group is not necessarily a terrible thing because it allows us to have a really good and valuable conversation throughout. So I wanted to introduce our speaker and our guest this month and give him a chance to really talk about his work and then open it up to a larger conversation. Professor Louis Rivers is a professor with NC State whose research focuses on the examination of risk judgment and decision process, especially in minority and marginalized communities, particularly with regards to natural environment and issues of environmental justice. He looks at bringing, I apologize, we're getting more people, which is great. He looks at bringing very technical issues that tend to leave most folks out of the civic conversations and the government process and make them understandable and attractive to a wider, to the wider general public who might want to be involved, thus helping us change regulation and overall policy making. And he does this within his research with NC State. He is also the newest member of the Chapel Hill Planning Commission and is very interested in the conversations that the thoughts that we have about zoning, land use, and I believe Chapel Hill overall. So I wanted to give Professor Rivers the floor to introduce himself and his work, and then I'll start with a few questions and we'll open it up to the floor to have questions from all y'all. So please, Professor Rivers.
Yeah, so when I talked to Nathan, we were going to try and keep it fairly open, question and answer. And I really do feel like I can learn a lot from this group. Like Nathan said, I'm a member of the Chapel Hill Planning Commission. I was recently reappointed, so I guess this is my second term, but I guess I was the first person reappointed. But I also serve on our, I am the environmental stewardship representative on the Planning Commission. So I had two things I wanted to say is like kind of like setting the ground, and then I'll stop talking because it's better to have conversation. And trust me, these things will relate to what we're talking about, even though they won't seem like it at first. So in my training, I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist. One of the things that we think about a lot is this thing about actor-observer differences. When I'm an actor and I do something or make a decision, I recognize that there's a world of context why I'm making my decision. Often as an actor, I see my decisions as being very much dictated by the context. Often it's not something I want to do, it's something I have to do. It's just complex. Someone who's observing my action will often assume that my decision is based on personal characteristics. I bring this up because I think that's a disconnect that I see often happening in so many spaces, especially when I think about land development in the Triangle. I think people are quick to assume the decisions made by developers and vice versa, decisions that some of our more vocal neighbors make are a part of their personality or personal characteristics. But I think it's important that we think about actor-observer differences. I recognize that everyone's working in regards to context. And I think that's important because I think there needs to be grace when we think about the decision that other people make that we don't agree with. I think there's often not much space for grace when I hear about land development in the Triangle. So I just put that out there at first to kind of think about the perspective I try to bring to conversations around development. And then the other one, which is also means to you slightly esoteric, is the idea that I think at the end of the day, most people kind of value the same things. I think we value equity. I think we value affordable housing. I think we value a healthy environment. I think we value having good neighbors and making the triangle a place where people can come and live. The question is, how do we get to those values? It's a huge question. So I think at the end of the day, a lot of people have the same end values, but the way we reach those values are often very different. And it's the fact that we often fail to focus that we share similar end values, but we often focus on the means to reach those values. I think that also leads to problems when you think about talking about these issues. So those are just kind of two things I wanted to start with.
Thank you. And I think those are really good points. I can't remember who had said it, but he was a well-known speaker who said that we each are 99.99% alike, and yet we spend most of our time focused on the 0.01% difference between us. And I think that's valuable to keep in mind when we're having conversations of context and issues around us, that we share a lot more than we might think that we do. I
guess one other thing, I see Jackie Turner in the audience. So Jack, there's a lot of overlap in stuff I do and what Jackie does professionally and what I kind of study. So I think Jackie should feel free to chime in where there are questions where she feels like she can contribute. Jackie has forgotten more about community engagement than I know. So I think we're lucky that she's on the call.
Well, that's great. And I will, answer some questions whenever. And I like working with you too, Louis. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's in terms of the environmental justice, social justice, the way I've sort of built my business the last few years is to just to really provide seats at the table for people who didn't even know there was a table. So that's where I start at, where I come from.
So, and Jackie is a co-chair of this committee, so it's perfectly placed. And she is actually one of she had come up with the agenda item for this meeting, actually, bring that forward. So this is really great. So while prepping for this call, Professor Rivers, you and I talked a little bit about decisions of how policy decisions are made, and the wider impacts on how that might not seem like they're related. So you had brought up things like affordable housing and the shared interest. When we're thinking about land use, particularly with affordable housing, what are some of the things that we need to consider when looking at developing affordable housing that are not necessarily related to the exact, buying the 2x4s for affordable housing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to think about in this affordable housing discussion. And also in our conversation, Nathan, we talked about how affordable housing and just housing in general is very much framed by histories of racism, especially in this part of the country. So maybe I'll have that as a starting place. And
please.
And in the conversation we talked about, I think most people are familiar with redlining today. I think most people are familiar with the historical racist practice. And I think it's easy to say that these practices have formally stopped and that we don't need to worry about them as much. But very much redlining, there's an argument to be made that it was still going into the mid 80s, early 90s in certain parts of the country. So, I'm not terribly old. I can clearly remember the 90s. So this is within many homeowners' current lifespan. So like that history of being limited where you could buy real estate and not be able to build wealth because you're cut off from those opportunities is still very much lingering with us today. So I think that's something that it's important that we constantly need to have in the background when we're thinking about these issues of affordable housing and just housing in general. And how do we provide housing to people in the triangle, which I think is very much on the path to being like, you know, potentially, I think maybe 5 years ago we would have thought this is extreme, but I think we're on the path to being similar to like the Bay Area. Just an extremely expensive place to live, where a lot of the local population who serve our everydays can't afford to live near where they work. But I say, so we realize there's this past history of racism, but we still have current practices today that kind of keep those practices or the spirit of those practices in place. And one example is this idea of credit scores, you know, and like getting access to credit and how that works. Because, and very much, you know, the credit score is a proprietary black box that we really don't know what goes into it. But we've seen studies that show that there's like systemic differences between Black people and other people in the United States in terms of credit scores and providing access to, you know, the money you need to buy a house to get access to that type of wealth. I bring all this up to say that I think we need to broaden what we consider affordable housing in the triangle. I think a lot of times when people think about affordable housing, we think about people who maybe have really low income jobs, or who maybe do not have jobs, maybe relying on the state for assistance. But I think in our area, a lot of people who need affordable housing are people who have college degrees, who have good jobs, but they don't have access to the wealth to afford housing in this area. So I think we need to expand what we think about in terms of affordable housing is one thing. But I think, and I guess we'll build on this later, but there's trade-offs that are constantly going on. And what I often see is that we pit affordable housing against other things, such as the value of nearby land, the value of my house. I think we just need to be clear about these things. Like, recognize the history of racism that has informed our current real estate situation today, and be willing to consider that when we're thinking about development of properties and development of affordable housing. Yeah, just be cognizant of that history. I think I may have gone off slightly, Nathan, if you want to bring me back on. But I think it's really important that that is something that's set up front. And I should be clear that, you know, considering the recent media flurry around talking about race and critical race theory and these type of things, I want to say up front that, like, I don't mean any of this as an attack on people. It's just, it's what happened. And it happened through systemic structures. And I think it's important that I also say that this is not due to individual agency. This is due to systems that were designed to purposely maintain these systems, to maintain, you know, segregation, even post Jim Crow. So these aren't the actions of individual people. I don't say any of this implying that this is because of evil developers, because of evil decisions people make. These are systemic issues. And if you truly believe something's systemic, you can't blame individuals for their perpetration, for them continuing to go forward. I hope that makes sense.
It really does. And in fact, I find that a lot of the decisions that policymakers with regards to environmental justice tend to be made with the best intentions, just not always viewing all the different impacts they might have. So Joel, you took yourself off of mute. Do you, you're a quiet soul. Do you want to say something?
Well, maybe I should give a background of environmental justice, a basic definition that we can all work with.
Absolutely.
So,
that's great.
Yeah, so when I think about environmental justice, I think about the fact that in our society today, some people burden disproportionately the harms and negative aspects related to our natural environment. So I think when we think about that, there may be like exposure to poor air quality, exposure to poor water quality, or exposure to, or the inability to have any water in certain parts of the country, potable drinking water. But that also goes into the built environment. Making sure environmental justice also relates to, like, maybe you live in an environment that exposes you to natural hazards that you shouldn't be exposed to, such as lead in the soil or lead in certain building materials, depending on the age of the housing that you're in. So I think that's one side of environmental justice. And that's the side we often focus on, this idea of like a lot of Black and brown and low income communities in the United States are disproportionately exposed to the bad parts of the environment. But I think the other side of environmental justice is that these same communities, not only are they exposed to the disproportionately to these negative aspects of the environment, they also do not have a chance to take advantage of the better parts of the environment. So they don't have, they don't have access to green spaces. They don't have access to like our national parks, or that access may be extremely difficult for them to get to. Or then in their local neighborhood, they may not have access to a greenway or to a park. So there's two aspects of environmental justice, of really trying to make sure that people aren't exposed to as much environmental harm, but also making sure that they have greater chance to participate in environmental goods.
Joel, do you want to jump in?
Well, I was just agreeing with a lot of what he's saying, but I think some of the trade-offs that he mentions, that, about not being evil people, but, for instance, some people see the existence of strict historical preservation areas or tree canopy issues as presenting obstacles to low-income housing because it reduces density or doesn't. So in other words, there are a lot of goals that people can pursue that they view as progressive that in fact, may have deleterious impacts on low-income people. And it's very hard for people to see that something they believe in that they think is good, like preserving a historic neighborhood or having, a huge tree canopy in an area, doing that may prevent increased density that will allow low-income people to live near transit, to walk to jobs, or even to get near parks. So I think that's, well, I was thinking about that as you were talking about the trade-offs. Does that make sense? And that's tough.
Well, and I think there's something very important to be said, and this is something that Professor Rivers and I talked a little bit about when we were prepping, is the fact that like it is all well and good to build affordable housing, but if you don't build affordable housing with transit connected and grocery stores and other things connected nearby, that those people in affordable housing will have to travel outside of that, and that you're creating unaffordable hurdles for people, whether you meant to or not. There's a lot of cases where, we're looking at good, we want to build more affordable housing, but the city is strapped and has to buy, based on price. Does that mean that, we put the affordable housing off to the side? And I think, we've had some conversations within WakeUp regarding a conversation with Morrisville and the airport, with a land use plan where they want to put a large amount of affordable housing out by the airport. And how does that fit into into making it equitable for everyone, but also are we putting people off to the side? Is that fair? Yes, they can afford to live, but now they have to travel very far to get to those resources, to their jobs, to other things. So it ultimately becomes a land use decision. Professor Rivers, how can, this group is sort of an odd collection of different people from the building trades and building professionals, as well as community members and nonprofits that work in this. So from your standpoint, how can this group address some of these issues, like land use impacts, to take in consideration of environmental justice issues while we're planning? It's sort of like, how do we recognize while we're doing our jobs that these might be issues, and addressing them right on?
Yeah, these are, I keep nodding my head. These are just very difficult issues. And, I don't want to skip over the complexity of it. But, and also part of these are values trade-offs. So I'll give an answer that reflects kind of my environmental training. So like, for my PhD, part of my work is really in the natural resources. And I had to learn a whole bunch of natural science that I really don't use much today, but I had to use it to get my degree for get through my comps. But I said this on the phone with you, Nathan. New York City is one of the most sustainable cities in the world. Mm-hmm. And people say that, and like, how's that the case? Well, it's because it's extremely dense. The density of New York City makes it much more sustainable than Chapel Hill and all of our lovely tree cover. And tree cover is great. And I don't say this trivially. I think preserving historical districts are also important, because I think a sense of place is important for people. But if we say we really care about the environment, I think it's better that we build on existing infrastructure rather than create a larger footprint. And I think we're seeing that if we want to see the future of building outside of a footprint, and I don't think we will have these issues, but we may have issues with flooding and other issues. Look at the West Coast and the wildfires. So those wildfires are definitely tied. I think you could say they're tied to climate change. They're tied to extremely dry conditions, but they're also tied to the fact that a lot of people are building what we call the wild urban interface. Mm-hmm. We have not been dense enough in our building, and due to property values, due to people needing housing, people started building without outside of city footprints. And now when we have fires, more people are threatened. And I think what we often see in a lot of areas, I imagine will happen in the Triangle, is that there will be a desire to maintain the character of this core area and to avoid density, because I think a lot of times when people say tree canopy, they're saying, I don't want to live near a duplex, or I don't want to live near apartments. And we'll be forced to put our affordable housing outside the existing infrastructure, which means an expansion of our existing infrastructure, which would be a greater impact on the natural environment than reducing tree cover. So that's kind of a cold technical response to that. But I think, it's hard to present that viewpoint when people are very much tied to their neighborhood character, or they're tied to, I think people seriously do think about trees when they think about their sense of place.
It's and I know we talked about this, but to bring in the sort of larger group, there's a conversation, and James and I are sort of chatting back and forth on some of this, but there's a conversation with regards to the bus rapid transit plan, where one of the pushbacks that we keep hearing, especially from a more white affluent community, is what about those trees? What about those beautiful trees along the median that will be pulled for this bus rapid transit system that ultimately will take thousands of cars off the road, help to provide jobs and access, and also be able to help defer, hopefully, gentrification and displacement issues, where people can live out in Nightdale instead of buying the house in Southeast Raleigh, and still have access to RTP and other sorts in downtown Raleigh. So I think these have real implications. Yeah, James.
Oh, I had to say, I had to jump in that I actually counted the trees the other day, and there are 11 taller trees, but there are a bunch of crepe myrtles. So I think there's even some, it's not like we're talking oaks.
Right.
But yeah, exactly. And so, the impact on the climate is huge, especially if we're talking about, the urban areas of New Bern Ave, where the more vehicles, the more buses, if we're not pursuing cleaner buses, can actually have a very big environmental impact. I don't know if you all remember, but there used to be a time when diesel buses, when they were sort of very popular, you had to run them in colder climates for an hour before you started to drive them. So, you know, these bus depots which were always in, you know, lower income, largely minority communities, would have these, you know, hundreds of buses blowing diesel out right in their backyard. So is there a value in again, both? We're, you know, pursuing cleaner vehicles, but also pursuing more transit and doing that around environmental, around places where you can build affordable housing and whatnot. So I guess my question to you, Professor Rivers, and anyone can jump in with other questions. I have prepared a few, but you know, please jump in with your own. My question to you with regards to some of this is projects like Downtown South or the Epic site. Those have very large impacts to our communities. They are, you know, they affect our watersheds. They affect, you know, how they're largely in communities of color and lower income communities as well. And so, how do those impact our environmental justice issues, and how do we address these things as they come in? Because we can't say no to everything.
No.
But we, you know, how do we make sure that we're addressing these as they come through?
I think one of the things that's been missing for a long time, is actual tools, things you can handle, or site trips or personal experiences that can help a group of people, whether they're residents or whomever, to talk about what they value and see that represented, not in a drawing, because not very many people are adept at reading drawings, even though planners and engineers and landscape architects, all those people use that as their medium. It is not well understood by people in the public as a tool for them. We have a proposal right next to my building for 40 stories next to our 5-story buildings. I found myself building a Lego model of what that would look like. And it's pretty dramatic. And it did ring true. It didn't help us with our zoning case. It went past the thing anyway. But it allowed people to respond to the scale and fundamentally, very few people get up in the morning and say, you know, I just really like everything to change. If we just all change, right, I'd be completely happy. So you have to take people from where they are and talk about what change could look like and what it might do. And that the worst case of, you know, 40 stories next to me, or, you know, 12 stories everywhere along Rupert Avenue is not the likely scenario. That there's room for modification. There's room for citizens to get in it with their hands and their eyes and their measurements of themselves and their community. But we are not using those tools. We are not equipping our staff or our engineers, landscape architects for that matter, with those tools. So that's not all of what I think about this topic, but if you want people to change, and we are talking about change, then you have to, I believe you have to find the tools that make it possible for a group to think together about what they share and where they diverge and what they can come together on. We don't do that very well right now.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jackie, because like, I think a lot of us have attachments to this Downtown South project and have thoughts about it. So,
yeah, I mean, but Downtown South aside, I think that for any of the projects that we've mentioned throughout here, and it started early on when someone, it may have been you, Louis, or Nathan, that said, you know, everybody really wants the same thing. And we all want to live well. We all want a shady front porch to sit on. we all want to be not too far from the grocery store and other things. And so how do you stave off those impacts to that way of life in that neighborhood, or how do you express that you want to have it if you haven't had it? It's part of the education. So it's informing people, letting them know that they're, going out into the community and saying, what do you want? What do you like? Not just go out and talk about, here's the new shiny project that's 40 stories. Tell us what you think about that. But ask them about what are some of the things that enhance their own quality of life. And then that you start to get to the essence, and it really has to be at not just at a big public meeting or a public hearing, but at a casual conversation level, with grassroots level and with existing community groups. And it takes time, and that's what they call, high touch versus high tech. Raleigh's very good with high tech, everything you can get on every portal and go back and look at every public meeting and watch the YouTube and take 6 surveys. But most people in Raleigh are not reached that way. I'm signed up for them, and I don't have time to look at all the ones that I'm bombarded with. And so you really have to do the high touch way, so engagement, engagement of the community needs to be built into the process. So the same way that you'd hire an engineer, you'd hire architects, you need to say that this is also a part of the project, and they need to allow, and they usually have someone on the team, but they need to understand the importance, provide the resources and the time. If your timeline is like this, you might not be able to get out there in time to bring people to the table. And you have to bring people to the table. So it's not just informing and educating and asking for input, but it's also that there's somebody who's sitting next to the architects and engineers that lives in the neighborhood, or that's part of the grassroots advocacy. So it's in that expanding that proverbial seat at the table, or I'm working on a project in Durham, and there's an actual seat at the table. There are community members on the steering committee and that sit in on the technical committee and on the engagement committee. And they also helped write the engagement plan. So you could propose a whole bunch of things, and they might say, this really isn't right for us, but we've got this festival coming up in September, and we'd like to have you have a table at it. So we need to understand how to share with non-professionals. And a lot of us here, we've spent our whole lives, I've spent 40 years doing that. So share with non-professionals. And then also you have to make sure that you're also compensating non-professionals. They don't want to sit next to you if you're making $150 an hour and they're doing it for free. So you can certainly find $18 an hour, $20 an hour to have them involved in the project and for the length of the project. But I also believe in making these people having them understand that it doesn't just stop with that project. After that, you now know the system. So now you can keep your ear to the ground for future projects. And so when somebody wants to expand a landfill near where you are, when someone wants to put a lane on the freeway and it's going to cause sound walls, when somebody wants to, put some new housing under the flight pattern onto the runway of an airport where the noise is, they will say they'll be within the crowd, the in circle, the cool people at the table. Although whoever called the folks that are engineers and planners the cool people, I don't know, but you'd be amongst that group. You'd hear about it, and you go and you tell your community. That's the real way, and I think that's where people can continually bang the drum, and it doesn't have to be in an angry, aggressive way, but it has to be in a persistent way, so people take you seriously. And we have to help people, give them the tools to make their arguments and make their case persuasive.
I think there's also an obligation on the part of the public bodies to help people with using deadlines as something useful. We've all participated in community engagement things that just went on and on and on because not everybody got together, and the policymakers were terrified of the community. They wouldn't, because they knew they wouldn't all come together. And so, oh dear, we better not let those people, is the appropriate word, keep us going, we won't ever get anything done. So there's a policy making role, I think, when you want to engage the community, that you help at every turn to use timeframes that are useful, because what you want is some accountability. You want to be able to show that what you decided on then guides whatever gets approved or not, or what gets on the ground, more importantly. And those things, policymakers tend to lose track of telling that story or helping people get where they are in the story.
Let me sort of put another perspective on this. I agree with everything Jackie is saying. The question I have is, where does sort of long-term data come in and analysis? So hypothetically, there's studies done by this guy, Raj Chetty, who's looked at the impact of living in different types of neighborhoods on people's life expectancy. And there is a huge increase in the life expectancy of very low income people when they live in what unfortunately sound like gentrified cities. Now, there's lots of bad things that happen with gentrification. But the idea that people who live in gentrified areas get better services, they're less likely to be a victim of a crime, they're less likely to be affected by environmental pollution, their kids get better schooling. I mean, those are also facts that are out there. Not saying that they're determinate, but that may not be part of the lived experience of the neighborhood. But it would seem to me that information like that has to be part of that equation as well. And I'm just curious what Professor Rivers thinks about that, or others think about about information like that.
Yeah, I imagine both Ann and Jackie want to jump in, but and this is hard, but what does it mean to have a gentrified neighborhood?
Right.
Are we saying the neighborhood that's near a grocery store, neighborhood that's clean water, neighborhood that feels safe? I mean, I think those are things that everybody wants, and maybe we should associate that with the process of gentrification. Yeah. I think,
right.
I want all these nice things in my neighborhood, but I also don't want it to happen because I'm leaving. I think,
right. I mean, I don't want to make that sound like, we should therefore, kick everybody out and stuff. But the point is that cities that tend to be more mixed, where more people of different types of income groups live closer to each other, tend to be wealthier, healthier, and wiser. And that becomes tricky. And sometimes that means people, having to live with change, which people don't always like. And that there are these trade-offs that we have to see, that not all of these policies are horrible and not all of these policies are good. So when we look at something like downtown South, there are probably going to be tremendous negative externalities, in my world, and also positive externalities. And that we have to understand the balance, and that we shouldn't make sure that the negative externalities don't fall on disadvantaged people, but understand also that there's a trade-off with the positive externalities that come from that type of work. And I think that's the kind of dialogue we need to have.
I think something that Jackie said that was really important is the idea that these communities need to be part of, when we think about consulting, they need to be part of the design in the projects. So I think often when we think about density and creating projects, members in the community that may be displaced or who may bear some of the negative aspects of that project, often they don't see themselves in that project. The people who are creating that project and the people in the neighborhood right next to it who are going to be overshadowed by this huge building, I imagine they have similar values. But when you go to create that dense apartment building, people in that neighborhood don't see themselves in that building. And that's because we're not talking to them until it's too late. So like Jackie said, I think it's incredibly important that we talk to people in communities. And so I'll go slightly off track, but I think we need to have a relationship with these communities. So just like, I hate that we got rid of the CACs. I think that was an incredibly valuable tool for certain people in South and Southeast Raleigh. And I think in a city like Raleigh, it would make sense to me for the city to have a person there just to build a relationship with that community, who's there every day. I think too often these communities only interact with developers or with city officials when something bad is happening to them. So it's always going to start on the wrong foot. Often, rarely are we seeking to build relationships in not even good times, just plain times. So I think we're asking for a lot of trust and a lot of input from communities that usually we don't want to talk to and we don't give much of a voice to. So I think a step back is to just create an ongoing relationship with these communities. I think that's something the city should invest in because it would benefit everyone.
And I'd like to ask Louis, just, and not to pit one city against the other, but you're in Chapel Hill, and you've probably observed and heard what's happening in Raleigh, and then you you probably know what's going on in Durham. But I was just thinking, do you think that there is one of the cities or towns that's doing it better than another, that's starting to try to do it better than another? And then also to look at, you mentioned downtown South, but if you also look at for New Bern Avenue, the BRT project, and there's the newest part of it is the transit oriented station design, and so I think that part of it is to make improvements in density and other features, and maybe grocery stores or whatever around these transit stations, but also to preserve the history and culture of the neighborhoods. That was, as I understood, what the goals were when they did the RFP, and I'm not involved in that project at all. But by contrast, I would hope that part of it is involving people from the neighborhoods, and I know they've used ambassadors. Part of that RFP was to have ambassadors and liaisons from within the neighborhoods be hopefully part of the planning and design process of how that change would occur. And that gets back to those things that, like Joel's point, the neighborhood is going to be, and let's not say gentrified, but just say that it's going to have some of the amenities that we'd all like to have in our neighborhoods, being able to walk to some things if we don't have a car, being able to go down to the C-store and get some good food, or at a grocery store get fresh food, and maybe not have school or daycare too far away. But I think that there's the potential there. So just within Raleigh, as it's evolved, it's maybe different than the downtown South project. But I'd be curious your thoughts between the three major triangle cities.
But just quickly, and Chapel Hill just approved a new large multi-use development. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little about the process they use there and how that might be different than what we're doing with downtown South, because they both seem to be a very large scale. Is that, Jackie, does that make sense?
That's the Aurora project you're referring to, Joel?
Yeah.
I am loath to try to...
After Professor Rivers, after you answer those, I think David Ulmer has a question he wants to also pose.
I am loath to say which of the cities are doing it better. I think there's strong things being done in all the cities and kind of shortcomings. I will be critical of Chapel Hill because I live here and I'm most familiar with what goes on here, and I've been on the planning commission for the last, I've been on for 3 years. So I started a midway appointment, and this is going to be my second full appointment. So I'll be done after this next 2 years. I think that Chapel Hill could do better in terms of planning. I often feel that Chapel Hill has taken advantage of its place in a triangle by dumping off housing issues to Durham and Raleigh and surrounding communities. And in an effort to maintain the character of Chapel Hill, we have really created a community that is not livable for most people. So I will not go into such critiques of other communities, Durham and Raleigh, because I don't have the same experiences with it. But I think for a number of reasons in Chapel Hill, whether it's extremely well-organized opposition, extreme high level of income for a lot of the residents, the kind of regressive nature of the university that really impacts the community also. I think I think of the 3 cities in the triangle, I often feel like we are the ones who are the least serious about the common issues that will be coming to the triangle. We're allowing the rest of the triangle to shoulder that burden, and we are trying to protect our trees. I'm sure people in Chapel Hill would not like that, but that's just what I see.
David, did you
So-
have?
Yeah, I guess a point or a question. I mean, I don't think it's completely inappropriate to be very skeptical of large projects. Just historically, whether you're going through how interstates went in, how we finance suburban sprawl in the 40s and 50s, the numerous, they're out there. And I think for me, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we think everything has to be a big project, as opposed to like a strongtowns.org approach. If you look at, we're going to spend tons of money on the park, Dick's Park. We're going to spend money on downtown South. And a lot of this money comes from the outside. And I think a lot of it has to do with people are just modest or not modest or humble. You're taking tons of money from the outside and it gets spent in local communities too fast. We use tax incentives to bring in high-paying tech jobs when we're already a booming tech sector. And it's very market distorting. And that causes that pace of change to even be faster. So how much would be better off just letting people by right do things like we agreed to in Raleigh last night, more ADUs, more duplexes, but then sometimes realize, hey, if we put in this bus rapid transit and it actually turns out to be nice and people like it, it's going to be the accelerant that changes that area even faster. If Dick's Park is as nice that everybody wants it to be, that area is going to change even faster. It seems like we say we want affordable housing and then we use everything we can to leverage outside dollars to rapidly change our neighborhoods as quickly as we can. So I don't understand where we are with that, like as far as a mindset.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I guess there's 2 things that I have 2 thoughts around that. First is many of our policymakers, their span of service don't coincide perfectly with projects. So I think often, you have a council member who's on there for like, 2 years? And honestly, if you're on any of these councils, there's just tremendous amount of things you have to, I know our packet for the planning commission may be like 200-300 pages. I can't imagine what the councils get in. So it's a pretty steep uphill climb to understand what's going on. So I don't think, if someone's new to the council, I don't think they really understand what's going on until they're middle of that first year or that second year. Not unless they're coming from another like intense commission or they have, professional interest in the issues of the council. So I think our policymakers are limited by this discrepancy between length of projects and length of time of service, and also just familiarity with what's going on. My default is to be skeptical of large projects also. But I also feel that there's pressures that we have to take seriously. I think climate change is an incredibly serious issue. And if we're going to be serious about addressing climate change, that means making big changes relatively quickly because it's kind of late in the day to address that. So, it's a conflict. I think it's complex, which, I think is like, may sound like a cop out, but I think all these issues we're bringing up are true and it's not simple.
One thing that I hear you saying, and I think I've heard echoed, especially by Jackie, is and others, is that we need to get people involved way further back in the process to help them own this process. And I think that that's true with larger projects too, and how to get those across. But I think that's true of all projects. I agree with you. I think that the city has the cities have huge responsibilities in that. I also think that there's an opportunity within developers and not just for-profit developers, but I know we have some nonprofit developers on this call, but they also have an opportunity to sort of bring in the public before it's a choice of, do you agree with, this model, yes or no? So do others have comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing, I forgot it. There's so little trust. I think for we have really, I think David brought up the complexity. I think this whole conversation we've been talking about the complexity of development, especially in a place like the Triangle. And one of the ways to address complexity is to trust developers and allow them to make creative solutions. But there's very little space for trust. And again, I'll go back to Chapel Hill. I think we can honestly be accused of trying to micromanage the development process because people have been burned in the past. So you've been burned in the past, and now you don't want to trust the developer to create an innovative project. And it's not just for profits, but also like, you know, nonprofit developers. But I think if we want people to have innovative solutions, we have to have a measure of trust that they could do something and that we can't pre-dictate the solutions to ever evolving problems. But that's a very difficult issue because it's hard to build trust. And I think, you know, rightly or wrongly, people are predisposed not to trust developers. I mean, they were the villains in all the movies when I was a kid. They constantly wanted to tear down the community center.
Well, Professor Rivers, how do we, with the time that we have left, how do we fix some of this? I know this is a hugely complex issue, and I know that we're not going to fix this with, you know, 7 minutes left in the hour. But how can we focus those solutions? Is it adding seats at the table? You know, a lot of times it's, you know, I hear people say, well, you know, after those folks get old enough to pass on, we'll be able to do this. But these decisions are way too big, and they're dealing with the next 30 years. These decisions cannot wait. So how do we do that, and how do we add those seats, and how do we address these things in just sort of short?
I mean, to be honest with you, I wish I had answers. We're struggling with these same questions in science. What you're talking about is this idea of co-production, bringing in the community to help you think about the vision of like how it should be. And currently in science, just yesterday, I was on an EPA panel where we spent 5 hours discussing this idea of what we call it co-production. How can we work with underserved frontline communities to make our science more equitable? And it's hard, you know, and I think Jackie is, I think if there's a takeaway point, I think it's, you know, really think about what Jackie said. Including representatives from communities in this process formally as early as possible in an intimate way. It can't be through email, it can't be through surveys. It has to be, they need a standing seat on committees that matter, that committees that actually make decisions. There's nothing worse than constantly inviting members to a community to just listen to you or to tell you what they want and then completely ignore it. So I think we have to think about creating institutions that provide voices to members of these communities, because more affluent communities are constantly being heard.
You know, I had some experience working on community-based decision-making when I was working with the mental health system. And one of the, I mean, it's important and you need to do everything that you're saying, but one of the frustrating things is you'll be working, you'll have a community meeting and you'll be meeting with people for 6 months and you'll come up with a plan and it's consensus, and then you'll present it and another group will say, well, we weren't part of that. And then you start the process over again with that group and you're working with that group, and then a third group comes in. It gets, you know, who's the community and where do you do that? We have to keep doing this, but we shouldn't think that it's easy. It's hard. And what the boundaries of a community is are that's tricky. But you know, I've done many of these, not in the housing area, but in a couple of other areas, and there's always another group that felt that they were excluded, and you didn't include the community. I mean, you're shaking your head. You've probably been through that as well, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah, it's hard. I think that's also a good take-home point. It's hard to work with these communities that I mean, you brought up something interesting, Joel, like who is our community? And often in Chapel Hill, I think about the community that I envision is not here in Chapel Hill. The people I think need to have a voice, they're not residents.
right.
They may work here, but they formally don't have voices in our development. So I'm thinking about the teachers in my son's school, the daycare workers in my youngest son's daycare, people that work in the service industry, many of them don't live in Chapel Hill, so they don't have access to the vote, which is like, kind of the easiest low hanging fruit from influence and policy, especially in a place in Chapel Hill. Your vote counts a lot.
Right.
If you get out there and you organize to get a council member you want on the council, that's a big deal. And you can have a lot to say there. But a lot of the people that I think about in terms of like our community is like, they could be part of it, but they're not part of it now. So like, how do you engage with those people? And how do you, and when you do seek to engage with people who aren't technically residents in the community, you get pushback from people who are residents in the community.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have any answers.
No, and I appreciate the honesty with that, because I think that there's a large belief that there's something that, that someone has that someone else is not doing. And I think that maybe what part of this is continuing to try many different things. And I don't think that there's going to be an aha moment of we solved it, but that as we sort of bumble through trying to build trust, we may actually build trust with community.
Right.
And it would be wonderful if we stumble upon a time when we can do that. And we, our elected officials are starting to see the impacts that are systemic, that are being done to other communities, and say, okay, yeah, no, we messed up, 25 years ago, and let's figure out a way to not do that again. It's always hard in public service to apologize for a problem that wasn't your decision, but I think that these are important times to do that. So Professor Rivers, thank you very much for spending this hour with us, helping us work through this. I hope that we actually can have you back and discuss this more in the future. And for this larger group, I want us to continue talking about this. With this community, this committee has a huge amount of responsibility. Many of you are decision makers, are engagement folks, are front facing to the public in many different ways, representing different voices. And the better that we understand some of these things, the better we can address them. It's sort of, I said to Professor Rivers before, it's like learning a word and then all of a sudden you see it everywhere. My hope is that we can do that with these issues. So I really appreciate your time, Professor Rivers. I appreciate this committee for coming together on this. And I hope you will join us next month as well. And just a shout out, if you have other ideas of things you want to know about and have an impact on land use decisions, please send them my way or to Jackie. We are always looking for great ideas to connect and help us learn as a committee to help drive WakeUp's agenda and push us forward. So
Nathan, I know you're trying to wrap up. I need to give a little bit of an advertisement. PEJ is looking for a program director, and our programs are very much focused on advocacy and engagement in the community. We've got lots of environmental issues, trash, flooding, and other sorts of things that probably would not be tolerated in other parts of the city. So if you spot somebody that is interested in taking on that work with a group of very dedicated people, give us a holler. We're looking hard. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this. I would love to come and talk with y'all again or just listen to some of your meetings. And I guess I would like to leave, like, really just to go back to what Jackie was saying. I think it's important that we build relationships with underserved frontline communities. And I use the term relationship purposely because if we think about if you're married to someone on this call, if you have a partner, you realize that a relationship's not always good. There are actually quite a few times where you have disagreement with your partners, but you don't stop seeing your partner because you have an agreement or argument, or they do something you don't agree with, because you have a relationship with them. And I think that's what we need to have with communities that have been traditionally left out. We're not going to agree all the time with perspectives in the community. I can tell you that now. I have heard things, I just grin and bear it. It's a relationship. So, you know, I think that's what we really should seek to create with different people in our community, especially communities that have been left out, like Southeast Raleigh.